You're a hunter-gatherer 13,000 years ago. No supermarkets, no refrigerators, no Uber Eats. You live in a cave carved into the limestone hills of what will one day become northern Israel, surrounded by people you actually like, which, let's be honest, is rarer than we think even today. You've been storing grain, not to farm it. Farming won't be invented for another 1,000 years, give or take. You're storing it the way you'd store anything you found in abundance, opportunistically, carefully, in a stone mortar hollowed out of the cave floor. And then something happens. Rain gets in. The grain sits wet for longer than you planned, and when you come back to it, it smells different, looks different. There's a faint bubbling you can't explain. Here's the thing about humans. We taste things anyway, so you do. And it doesn't kill you. In fact, and this is the part that changes everything, it makes you feel warm and strange and slightly outside yourself in a way that has no name yet because language is still a work in progress. You don't know what fermentation is. You don't know what yeast is. You have no framework for what just happened to your grain, but you remember it. You tell people, you try to make it happen again. That moment, messy, accidental, probably a little disgusting, is where the story of alcohol begins. Not in a winery in ancient Greece, not in a monastery in medieval Europe, in a burial cave near modern-day Haifa, in a stone mortar 13,000 years ago. And the reason we know this isn't legend or inference or educated guessing, it's residue analysis. Stanford archaeologist Li Liu and her team found the actual molecular fingerprints of a three-stage brewing process embedded in the rock itself. Starch granules and phytoliths, the microscopic remains of a fermentation sequence that survived longer than every civilization you learned about in school, which is already remarkable. But here's what's genuinely strange. That moment in the cave wasn't the beginning of the biological story, not even close. The machinery that made fermentation appealing to that hunter-gatherer, the enzyme that lets your body process alcohol, the neurological reward that makes the warmth feel good, that was already 10 million years old before anyone ever touched a drop. The decision to drink was made for us long before we existed to make it. 10 million years ago, your ancestors were drunk. Not intentionally, not recreationally, just chemically, inevitably, as a matter of basic survival, drunk. Here's what was happening. Fruit falls from trees. It always has. And when fruit falls and sits on the ground in warm air, wild yeast lands on it and begins converting its sugars into ethanol. This is not a human invention. This is not even a biological accident. It's just chemistry, doing what chemistry does, completely indifferent to what any primate thinks about it. The fruit ferments. It develops a faint alcoholic content, somewhere around 1 to 2%, which is low, but not nothing. And it smells different, sharper, more pungent, easier to detect from a distance, which turns out to matter enormously, because sometime around 10 million years ago, a mutation occurred in a single common ancestor of humans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. A mutation in the gene that produces an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, ADH4, if you want the technical name. And this mutation made that enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol than it had been before. 40 times, in one generation. The primates who carried it could smell fermented fruit from farther away, follow the scent accurately, eat more of it without getting sick, and extract more calories from it than their competitors. Natural selection, which has no opinions and no preferences, and absolutely no interest in your relationship with wine, kept that mutation. Kept it hard. Every primate descended from that ancestor, every human, every gorilla, every chimpanzee alive today, carries a version of ADH4 optimized for alcohol processing. This is not a cultural inheritance. It's not a habit. It's written into your genome the same way your eye color is. The drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley in 2004, gives this a name and a framework. The idea that the human attraction to alcohol isn't a modern malfunction, but an ancient, adaptive signal, millions of years in the making, pointing toward calories and right food in an environment where both were genuinely hard to find. The scent of ethanol meant food. Food meant survival. The preference got reinforced, generation after generation after generation, for 10 million years.
You didn't develop a taste for alcohol, you inherited one.
There's a chimpanzee in the Basu forest of Guinea who uses a leaf as a cup to drink fermented palm wine from a tapped tree, and she does it with what researchers describe as deliberate, repeated, purposeful behavior. She's not confused. She knows exactly what she's doing. She's been doing it, evolutionarily speaking, longer than we have. So what separates a chimpanzee drinking fermented palm wine from a Natufian brewing it on purpose? Intention. And intention is the whole game. Accidental fermentation is old. Intentional fermentation, the decision to make it happen, to build a process around it, to repeat it reliably, that's the leap that changes everything. And the evidence for when that leap happened is sitting in a cave in the Carmel mountain range near modern-day Haifa, in the form of stone mortars that haven't moved in 13,000 years. The Natufians are worth knowing. Semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, they were the people of the Eastern Mediterranean at the tail end of the last ice age, a culture that buried their dead with flowers, kept dogs as companions, and wore jewelry made from shells traded across hundreds of kilometers of landscape. These were not simple people. They had aesthetics, they had ritual, they had, as it turns out, a brewing operation. Li Lu is a Stanford archaeologist who spent years analyzing the residue inside those Rakafet cave mortars. What she found was not the trace of a single accidental spoilage. It was starch granules and phytoliths, microscopic plant structures, arranged in a pattern consistent with a deliberate, repeatable three-stage brewing process. Soaking grain, germinating it to release sugars, fermenting the result. That's not stumbling onto something bubbly and drinking it anyway. That's a recipe, embedded in rock, 13,000 years old. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment, it genuinely helps. Anyway, here's where it tilts into something stranger. The Natufians were not farmers. They didn't grow the grain they were brewing. They gathered it from wild stands of cereal grass, hauled it back to the cave, and processed it there, in a cave they also used to bury their dead. The brewing wasn't happening in a kitchen or a tavern or anything resembling a production facility. It was happening in a place of mourning, of ritual, of whatever they understood the relationship between the living and the dead to be. The oldest confirmed intentional alcohol in the world was made in a burial cave, not for a party, not for trade, for the dead, or for the people grieving them, or for some ceremony that sat somewhere between those two things and had a name we'll never know. Robert Dudley gave us the biological framework, 10 million years of adaptive preference. Li Liu gave us the archaeological proof, 13,000 years of confirmed intentional production. Between those two facts sits the entire question of why. And the answer, it turns out, was never as simple as wanting to feel good. Agriculture is supposed to be the beginning of everything. That's the story we tell. Hunter-gatherers wandering, then someone plants a seed, and suddenly you get villages, cities, writing, civilization, the whole cascade. Farming as the first domino. But there's a problem with that story, and it's been bothering archaeologists for decades. Why would anyone do it? Genuinely, think about it from first principles. You're a Natufian, you're mobile, you're skilled, you know this landscape the way you know your own hands, and you're reasonably well fed by moving with the seasons and following food sources that have sustained your people for thousands of years. Farming, by contrast, means staying in one place, breaking up hard ground with stone tools, planting seeds, waiting months for them to grow, defending the crop from animals and weather and other people, and then doing it all again. The caloric return in the early years of agriculture was almost certainly worse than hunting and gathering, not better. So what would make that trade-off worthwhile? The beer hypothesis, championed most forcefully by archaeologist Brian Hayden at Simon Fraser University, says the answer was never bread. It was fermented grain. Reliable, repeatable, socially transformative fermented grain. The argument goes like this. Feasting was a primary mechanism of social power in hunter-gatherer societies. The person who could provide an extraordinary communal experience, food, drink, ceremony, accumulated influence, and obligation in return. Alcohol, in that context, wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that made people show up, stay, cooperate, owe you something. Hayden's hypothesis is contested, vigorously. Other archaeologists point out that the earliest domesticated grains show signs of selection for bread-making qualities, not brewing ones, and that the caloric argument for beer doesn't quite add up at small scales. The honest answer is that we don't know which came first, and we probably never will with certainty. The archaeological record doesn't preserve motivation, only residue. But here's what the residue does show. The brewing at Rockefet Cave predates the earliest confirmed agriculture in the same region by somewhere around 1,000 years. 1,000 years is not a rounding error. That's roughly the distance between us and the Norman conquest of England, a gap wide enough to contain entire civilizations. Whatever the Natufians were brewing for, they were doing it before anyone in the archaeological record had committed to farming. Before the first field was cleared, before the first seed was deliberately planted in prepared soil. The oldest intentional alcohol we found was made by people who were still, technically, hunter-gatherers. They were brewing in a burial cave, for the dead, and then, 1,000 years later, someone decided to stay. 9,000 years ago, on the other side of the world, someone in central China's Yellow River Valley made a drink from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, sealed it in a clay vessel, and left it in the ground. They had never heard of the Natufians. They had no knowledge of Rockefet Cave. There was no contact, no shared tradition, no cultural thread connecting them to the Eastern Mediterranean whatsoever. They arrived at fermentation anyway. The evidence comes from Jiahu, a Neolithic village site excavated in Henan province, where chemist Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania analyzed the residue inside pottery shards and found the chemical signatures of a mixed fermented beverage: rice, honey, hawthorn, and possibly wild grape, dating to around 9,000 years ago. The vessel itself is small enough to hold in 2 hands. The chemistry inside it survived 9 millennia in the soil, waiting. Then move northwest, to the South Caucasus, the mountainous region that sits roughly where modern Georgia is. At a site called Gatatrili Gora, archaeologists found large ceramic jars with interior surfaces stained by tartaric acid, malic acid, and citric acid, the unmistakable chemical fingerprint of fermented grape juice. 8,000 years old. The oldest confirmed wine in the world, sitting in jars that were buried in a village floor, kept cool, kept close. 2 sites, 2 continents, 0 contact, same discovery. And it keeps going. Fermented beverages appear independently in sub-Saharan Africa, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, in ancient India, in Bronze Age Scandinavia. Every culture that had access to sugar-containing plants in sufficient time, which is to say, every culture, eventually figured out fermentation. Not most of them, all of them. The variation is in the ingredients: agave, maize, cassava, palm sap, mare's milk, honey, rice, barley, grape. The process is always the same. This is not a coincidence. It's not a lucky accident that spread outward from one point of origin. Fermentation is something humans, when given the raw materials and enough curiosity, will discover on their own. Every time, without exception. Which means it isn't really a discovery at all. It's more like an inevitability, a conclusion that the chemistry of sugar and the biology of yeast and the restlessness of the human mind will always reach together, given enough time. McGovern has spent his career chasing these chemical signatures across the ancient world, and he calls the pattern convergent fermentation, the same solution arrived at independently, repeatedly, across every inhabited continent. I find that either deeply comforting or slightly unsettling depending on the day, and I haven't decided which. The jars at Gatatrili Gora held 8,000-year-old wine. Someone made a label for them, we just can't read it. Sumer did not discover alcohol. By the time the first Mesopotamian cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates, fermentation was already ancient, already thousands of years old, already embedded in ritual and community and the management of grief. What Sumer did was bureaucratize it, and that turn, from sacred to administrative, is its own kind of remarkable. Sumerian workers received daily beer rations recorded on clay tablets with the precision of a modern payroll system. Not approximate rations, exact ones, graded by job title and social rank. Standard laborers got one measure, supervisors got more, high officials got the good stuff. The tablets that record this are among the oldest administrative documents ever found. Humanity's first spreadsheets were, functionally, beer ledgers, but the bureaucracy sat alongside something older and stranger. The Sumerians also had ninkasi, Hathor, whose name translates directly as the lady who fills the mouth, a goddess whose entire divine portfolio was beer. Not wine, not all alcohol, specifically beer. There was a hymn written in her honor around 1800 BCE, composed in the form of praise poetry that doubles as a complete and technically accurate brewing recipe. Grain, malt, baking, fermentation, the vessels used, the sequence of steps, every stage, embedded in devotion. In 1989, a brewer named Fritz Maytag, who ran Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, worked with archaeologists to reconstruct the recipe from the hymn and brew an actual batch. It worked. 3,800 years after the poem was written, the beer was still makeable, still drinkable, and by accounts, served at a professional gathering. Not terrible. The recipe survived longer than every empire that came after Sumer, longer than Rome, longer than everything. Egypt ran a parallel operation. Beer was public health infrastructure. Workers building the pyramids at Giza received daily rations of beer as part of their wages, because beer made from boiled water was safer to drink than the Nile. Wine existed too, but wine was prestige. Wine was for pharaohs and priests and people with something to prove. The world's oldest wine labels, actual labels identifying vineyard, vintage, and quality, were found sealed inside royal tombs, sitting in jars that hadn't been opened in 3,000 years. The Code of Hammurabi, Babylon's great written legal code from around 1750 BCE, included specific consumer protection legislation for beer. If you watered down your beer, the punishment was being thrown into the river. Humanity's first major attempt at written law made room explicitly for beer quality standards. Beer was wages. Beer was prayer. Beer was medicine and public sanitation and the social contract and the thing you got thrown in a river for adulterating. All at once, in the same civilization, sometimes in the same document. We have, as a species, always known what matters. Pull back far enough and the whole timeline snaps into focus at once. 10 million years of biological preparation, 13,000 years of confirmed intentional production, 9,000 years of independent reinvention on the other side of the planet, 8,000 years of wine in Georgia, 5,000 years of Sumerian beer ledgers, 3,800 years of a hymn that is also a recipe, an unbroken chain of fermentation knowledge, passed forward through every generation that ever lived, connecting a Neolithic pottery vessel to every bar and winery and kitchen in the world today. That chain has never broken. Not once. What's striking, and I keep coming back to this, is that across every culture where the earliest evidence has been studied, the first confirmed alcohol was never purely recreational. It was ritual. It was sacred. It was for the dead, or for the gods, or for the ceremonies that sat at the boundary between those two things. The Natufians brewed in a burial cave. The Sumerians wrote hymns to a beer goddess. The earliest wine in Georgia was found buried in a village floor, kept close, kept deliberate. Every independent discovery on every continent arrived wrapped in meaning before it arrived wrapped in pleasure. That's not a coincidence either. That's something about us. We don't know exactly why the sacred came first. We probably never will. Motivation doesn't fossilize, and the people who could tell us have been gone for thousands of years. The honest answer is that we're reading the residue of their inner lives from the chemistry left in their pottery, and there are limits to what chemistry can say about what something meant to the person who made it. But here's what the residue does say, clearly and consistently. From the very beginning,